criticize Obama? Okay, I will criticize Obama. Personally, I think his tan suit was bad, okay? Now that I've finished my substantive criticisms of Obama, let me get into my less substantive criticisms of Obama. So recently, I think it was like 8 or 9 days ago, Obama did an interview with CNN, former president of the United States. They're asking him about the issues that America's facing today. But while asking him about those questions, they had to revisit his time in the administration. And I saw them ask him about Ukraine in a way that I haven't seen anybody talk to him about Ukraine before, because they didn't talk to him as if he was just like an idle person on the sidelines monitoring the situation, giving his 2 cents. They reminded him that he was president in 2014 when the Russians first invaded and annexed Crimea, funneled weapons into the Donbass to Donbass separatists, and sent agents and soldiers into the Donbass, while lying about it the entirety of the time. He was president at the time, and as president, as the chief executive, he was supposed to be the point person on foreign policy. He was supposed to be the person guiding foreign policy on Ukraine forward. And so the CNN analyst asked him, like, look, looking back at how you tried to engage with Putin and what ended up happening after your time in office, and you're trying to settle it with Putin with the Minsk Accords and everything, you know, hindsight is 2020, but did you guys fail in engaging with them? And he gave a very interesting answer. And if I'm being completely honest with you, he also lied. Let's listen to it.
So obviously hindsight is a great thing, 2020 vision is a great thing, but you experienced while you were in office Putin's first invasion, the annexation of Crimea. And many people said neither you nor the Western allies stood up and put enough red lines around him around that. So what's your reaction to that? And I want to just add also, your friend, your good friend and colleague, Angela Merkel, is under very serious criticism right now. I know you've just met with her recently. Should she have leveraged, you know, Germany's economy, its energy on the addiction to cheap energy in Russia? Was that a mistake?
Well, you know, I think the Ukraine of that time is not the Ukraine that we're talking about today. There's a reason why there was not an armed invasion of Crimea, because Crimea was full of a lot of Russian speakers, and there was some sympathy to the view that Russia was representing its interests. The Rada at the time, the Ukrainian parliament itself, still had a number of Russian sympathizers, and the politics inside Ukraine were more complicated. And part of what happened was both myself, but also Merkel, who I give enormous credit for, had to pull in a lot of other Europeans kicking and screaming to impose the sanctions that we did and to prevent Putin from continuing through the Donbass into the rest of Ukraine. So I actually think that given both where Ukraine was at the time and where the European mindset was at the time, we held the line. And part of what happened was, over time, a sense of Ukrainian identity separate from Russia and a determination to push back against Russia and an ability to prepare both militarily and civically to resist Russian pressure. They built up those muscles, and that's part of the reason why they were able to respond the way they did when you actually saw what was, in my view at least, incredibly misguided, not to mention illegal and incredibly cruel incursion by Russian forces.
Do you think Putin should have been challenged more then?
I think that we challenged Putin with the tools that we had at the time, given where Ukraine was at the time.
Okay, so I wanted to make sure that he got to say everything he wanted to say uninterrupted, and I didn't just like snip here, say something there. So first things first, I want to give some credit to Barack Obama. I'm going to give 2 points of credit to Barack Obama. So the first point of credit I want to give to Barack Obama is something he mentioned, I think, midway through.
We held the line.
Yeah, right here.
Continuing through the Donbass into the rest of Ukraine. So I actually think that given both where Ukraine was at the time and where the European mindset was at the time, we held the line.
The interesting part here is not really the Ukraine part where it says where Ukraine was at the time, where Europe was at the time. If you look at European politics in 2014 when the Russians first invaded Ukraine, if you think Obama didn't show enough action on Ukraine, then comparing that to like Germany basically didn't want to do almost anything because of their deep economic interests with Russia. Angela Merkel's policy on Ukraine is regarded by many people to be a failure. And that's part of the reason why you're seeing Angela Merkel and a lot of these revealed recent interviews talking about Minsk more as, well, you know, we bought the Ukrainians time. Because their peacemaking, when it came to the peacemaking element of it, failed completely. They failed in stopping the violence, and they failed in dissuading the Russians by their response, because the lack of response from the West sent the message to Vladimir Putin, not just from the United States, but from France, but from Germany, but from the entirety of NATO. The lack of response emboldened him and made him think, they don't care about Ukraine. We can do whatever we want here, and if we do it fast enough, it'll be too fast for them to respond in the first place, which eventually led to the 2022 invasion of Ukraine in February of that year, right? So this isn't just an issue of Barack Obama. This is an issue of all of the NATO alliance, all of the most of the European Union, and if anything, the United States was probably more active in supporting Ukraine than most European allies at the time. So I do want to give that distinction. I also want to give a second distinction that it is true. Not so much, I think, about the Ukrainian identity, even though Ukrainian identity has evolved over the last ideas. Ukrainian identity has existed for a very long time. But when it comes to the state of the Ukrainian military in 2014, it was in a haphazard state. It was very, very bad. It did not look professional. It had a lot of people on paper, but not a lot of people out in the field. Definitely people who actually were out in the field and could fight competently, and they were unable to push the separatists out of the Donbass. And they failed in the counterterrorism operation of reclaiming the rest of the Donbass. And that's part of the reason why Right Sector and a lot of these other groups started volunteer paramilitary groups in order to fight the rebels, the separatists in the Donbass. And so it is true that the military situation compared to the much more professional standards of the Ukrainian military today was very, very, very different. Now that I've put those two things out of the way, the first major glaring critique and criticism, the thing that stood out to me more than anything else in the world, is the statement, there was no armed invasion of Crimea. That is ahistorical, that is wrong, that is a lie, and quite frankly, that's almost bordering on Russian propaganda. And I don't think that was his intention. I think he more meant an invasion or battle or war of the style we're seeing now did not happen in Crimea, because there was a lot less resistance and the Russians were able to actually do their operation a lot quicker. You know, Crimea is a lot smaller than all of Ukraine. The goals of the Crimean annexation were a lot smaller than the goals of the 2022 invasion of all of Ukraine. Not to mention they also had standing troops at the base in Sevastopol, which gave them a foothold that they could launch the operation out of, right? But just because the Russians lied about it at the time and said, we're not invading, even though later they admitted that they were, doesn't mean it wasn't an invasion. It was an armed invasion. They were armed soldiers that crossed into internationally recognized Ukrainian territory and took land. Like if I look up invasion of Crimea, if I look this up, what do I see? Do those not look like armed soldiers? Do those do not look like armed invaders? Because they certainly look like an army to me. Even if they didn't have a patch on their arm, they certainly look like an armed invading army to me. And I think one of the clearer things I could show you guys in reference to this would probably be what Igor Girkin said, a Russian war criminal who was involved in the shooting down of a civilian airliner. He's also the former defense minister for the Donetsk People's Republic, the Russian proxy puppet state in occupied Ukraine. Well, former a puppet state. Now it's been annexed by the Russians. He's also a former FSB agent and a known Russian military blogger. He was also involved in the war very heavily during the early stages. As I said, he was the former defense minister for the Defense People's Republic, and he self-professedly, by the way, this isn't like a deep investigation I'm doing here. He said this publicly. He was involved in the annexation of Crimea. And according to him, he took militiamen, walked into the Crimean parliament, and held the elected officials at gunpoint, making them secede from Ukraine. And he said this publicly on a Russian talk show. I'll read the subtitles.
Николай, вы в Крыму-то когда были?
I was there on the 16th of March for the referendum. Well, pardon me, but I was in Crimea from the 21st of February. And you know what? What you're telling me is absolute bull. Furthermore, unfortunately, I didn't see any support from any organ or government of power. In Simferopol, where I was located, I didn't see the support. It wasn't there. The Crimean deputies were rounded up by our militias in order to corral them into the hall and make them vote for the secession from Ukraine. Yes, I was proud to command these militias. I saw all of them from the inside with my own eyes. Now note that these militias and these local groups were working in tandem with the invading Russian army that had removed their patches. So, again, I really don't like the way that Obama defined this. Obama talked about it. While it's true that the violence in comparison to now was much less, it was still an armed invasion. He could say it wasn't a war, maybe. He could say that the invasion of Crimea wouldn't be its own war because, you know, there wasn't much resistance posed by the Ukrainian government. It's still an armed invasion. There was still an invasion of the Sudetenland, you know? There was still an invasion of Czechoslovakia, even if the Czechs didn't put up nearly as much resistance as maybe other countries. They did put up some. But you get what I'm saying, that this was still an armed invasion. And this is my first major problem with Obama's statement here. Now, the second thing I want to get on is this idea of like, look, we held the line as much as we could have. Since then, Ukraine has developed so much. Their identity is so much more clear now. You know, now it's much different. Now, it is true that Ukrainian society has progressed since 2014. The Ukrainian military has progressed. It has dealt somewhat with the corruption, even though it still has a long way to go. The Ukrainian identity has evolved during this war. But all of the reasons to send Ukraine military aid existed since 2014, and they have existed for the last 8 years. And under Obama's time in office, he did not send them any quote-unquote lethal military aid. Now, what do I mean by lethal military aid? What I mean is military aid that'll blow up the invader, the invading army, the occupier. You get the idea. He did send counter artillery radar. He did send some equipment, but nothing that could actually be used to hold back an invading army. Something that would only be reversed during the Trump administration. Not because of the steadfast actions of Donald Trump in support of Ukraine. Donald Trump actually tried to hold up the aid to Ukraine in return for dirt on his political opponents, dirt on Hunter Biden and Joe Biden, that he tried to elicit from Zelensky, and an illegal phone call to Zelensky where he tried to, you know, elicit information on his political opponent, which was wrong, immoral, probably illegal, and also very much outside of the bounds of his authority in office, since the aid was already congressionally approved. And if something's been congressionally approved, he can't just hold it over somebody's head and try to delay it for political favors. So it was only in 2019 that, you know, that type of aid actually started to make its way into the hands of the Ukrainian military 3 years before the invasion. Now imagine if we would have started that in 2014. If we would have started a lot of these integration processes a lot faster. We did some, but every issue that Ukraine has when it comes to logistics and when it comes to training on Western gear, these issues would be much less if we started earlier. If we had a 3-year, 4-year advantage. If we didn't send that stuff in 2019, we sent that stuff in 2014 as an immediate response to Vladimir Putin, which would not only prepare the Ukrainians to defend their country, but maybe have acted as a stronger immediate deterrent to Russian aggression. And that's not the only problem I have with Obama's response at the time, right? Or because even like this response would apply equally to the vast majority of European countries, if not more so. He still had the authority to do this unilaterally if he wanted to. But if you look at other statements Obama gave during 2014, you can start to get an idea about why Vladimir Putin maybe didn't feel like this was a #1 security priority or a priority for the Americans to stop them from doing this. Here's from an interview Obama gave in 2014. Obama made clear that he is only going to involve America more deeply in places like the Middle East to the extent that the different communities there agreed to an inclusive politics of no victor, no vanquished. The United States is not going to be the air force of the Iraqi Shiites or any other faction. Despite Western sanctions, he cautioned, President Vladimir Putin of Russia could invade Ukraine at any time. And if he does, now listen to this bold, strong statement. Trying to find our way back to a cooperative, functioning relationship with Russia during the remainder of my term will be much more difficult. Wow. At the prospect of Russia conquering Ukraine, he said, man, it would be pretty hard to be best buddies if you conquered the Ukrainians. He didn't even need to, we should have given them more aid, but you could have given a stronger statement than this, huh? Something that showed that we were a little bit more committed to Ukrainian independence. And if that isn't enough, Christopher Miller, a really good reporter, he wrote a book called The War Came to Us, where he talked to a lot of people in Ukraine about the war in Ukraine, about the Russian invasion. And there's a section from the book that I want to read that he posted when this interview was published that talks about how the acting Ukrainian president told Christopher Miller that the United States government basically told Ukraine to stand down and that the United States would not give them help as we said we would with the Budapest Memorandum, or if we were to give them help as we agreed we would do in the Budapest Memorandum when Ukraine gave up its nuclear arsenal, and that was part of the return they got for giving up their nuclear arsenal after the collapse of the Soviet Union, and was territorial guarantees from both Russia and the United States. Instead, we told them to back down. Let me read the section. I turned to our partners, including the United States of America and the leaders of the European Union, for help, referring to the Budapest Memorandum that Ukraine had given up nuclear weapons in exchange for security guarantees from them. But they told me explicitly that there would be no military help. Both the Obama administration and the European leaders told me that they were categorically against the supply of any weapons to Ukraine. And they justified this to me by saying that they do not want to provoke Putin and increase the risk of Russian aggression. Well, that didn't work very well, did it? Anyway, Obama's interview here is very, very subpar, to say the least. I expected a much better response. I would have thought that he would have, maybe came up with a better response, since with this war happening for almost 2 years now, he's had enough time to reflect on his time in office before the Trump administration and what he could have done better, definitely since the invasion of Crimea happened under his presidency. But instead of any reflection on this is what we should have done, maybe, or this is a different thing we could have done, that I hope my predecessors learned from, it's just, well, Ukraine was very different then, and it's really built up its identity now, and it totally wasn't an armed invasion then, and the situation's very different. It just feels like a bunch of excuses. And some of the things he said, they did have grounding. When he talks about Europe, it is true that after the invasion of Iraq and invasion of Afghanistan, America did not want to, was not super hyped about entering more military engagements unilaterally. It wanted to build up coalitions. And if the European partners that are more closely connected to Ukraine, whose interests are more directly threatened by the Russian invasion of Ukraine, didn't want to send weapons, didn't want to work to coordinate a military response or aid package of any kind, then it's kind of hard to make the pitch to Obama. I understand that, but long term, definitely with hindsight that Obama can look back upon now, they made the rhetoric he used was not strong enough. They did not work fast enough to start the aid packages to Ukraine, and the worry that sending aid to Ukraine would provoke Russian aggression just turned out being a completely pointless concern that ended up holding back vital aid necessary for Ukraine's defense. So personally, I think this is one of Obama's worst interviews when it comes to the issue of Ukraine, from his time in office or his time after office, talking about his policies afterwards. Really not a great interview for Barack Obama. Pretty bad look.